today. Appreciate it so very much. And even though there wasn't donuts, I'm sorry about that. Hopefully you got your fill of other things. We're going to get right into it. So if you'll find the handout entitled Just Walk With Me. Now, if you just sit and listen the rest of the day, it's going to get boring very easily. And you also might fall asleep. So feel free to make comments, ask questions, because that's what we're here for, to invite your discussion and such like. But perhaps this statement here might be somewhat the way you feel this morning in regards to what you are dealing with. So follow along as I read with you. I have a problem. I want to tell you about it, but no, I really don't. I'd rather keep it to myself, handle it alone. I do think it'd be good for me to share it with you, but I really don't want to because of what you'll say or how you'll act. I'm afraid that you might feel sorry for me in a way that makes me feel pathetic, like I'm some poor thing. I'm afraid you'll try to cheer me up, that you'll give me words or text or prayers that tell me in a subtle way to stop feeling bad. If you do that, I'll feel worse, but hide it behind my obedient, cheerful smile. I'll feel you don't understand. I'll feel you making light of my problem, like it can be brushed away with some brief words of cheer. I'm afraid you're going to give me an answer that this problem I've been wrestling with for some time now, and I've had endless thoughts, you will belittle. You mean you can answer in a half minute what I struggled with for weeks, maybe even months. I'm afraid also you might ignore my problem, talk quickly about other things, or tell me of your own. I'm afraid, too, you might see me stronger than I am, not needing you to listen and care. It's true I can get along alone, but I shouldn't have to. What I'd really like is for you just to walk with me. Listen as I begin in some blundering, clumsy way to break through my fearfulness of being exposed as weak. Hold my hand and pull me gently as I falter and begin to draw back. Say a word, make a motion or a sound that says, I'm with you. If you've been where I am, tell me how you felt in a way that I know you're trying to walk with me, not change me. But I'm afraid that you think I'm too weak to deserve respect and responsibility. Or you'll explain to me what's happening with labels and interpretation. Or you'll just ask, what are you going to do about it? Please just walk with me. All those other things seem so much brighter and sharper, smarter and expert. But what really takes love is to just walk with me. I'm sure what I want is people who have a shepherd as their model. People who in their own way bring to others an experience of the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Why is it difficult for others to walk with us in our grief? What makes it hard? Yes, sir.
They're uncomfortable.
They're uncomfortable. Yeah. And why would they be uncomfortable?
Because they don't know.
Because they don't know what to say. I mean, we can talk about the weather, we can talk about sports, we can talk about other things, and everybody that's a commonality. But, you know, if we were to come up, well, how's your grief journey going? You know, they just sort of look at you like, where did you come from? Yes, sir.
In Africa, there was something that I learned when I would go to someone's house. A lot of times, they would sit me down and they'd just sit there and not say a word, just be together. And I've often thought that that's something we need to be able to do with people, whatever.
Very good point. Very good point. And we're going to say that over and over again today and also tomorrow. Nothing takes the place of your presence. E-N-C-E, not the other. Just being there. That's biblical. We'll look at that. But that's exactly right. So folks are uncomfortable. They don't know what to say. They may be afraid of your emotions, but they also may be afraid of their emotions in regards to what you have to say. You know, that number one question, how are you doing? Number one answer, I'm fine. Why do we say that? Why do we say I'm fine when that might not necessarily be the situation? I'm sorry.
It's what's expected.
It's what is expected. It's what is expected. Also, we may think that if we say that, they'll leave us alone. Or in their mind, they may, okay, I asked, I can check that off and go on to something else. When in fact of the matter is, that's not the situation. So we just need to understand that walking with people and being there for them, it doesn't mean that we have to have all the answers or even know all the questions, but it's just the idea that being there. Let's look at what do you know about grief and loss, the next handout, I believe. These come from a great book by Therese Rondo, How to Go On Living When Someone You Love Dies. These are true or false statements, and hopefully will gender some discussion. Number one, it normally takes 1 year to get over your grief. False. There's a lot of problems with that statement. First of all, normally. What's normal? What may be normal for you may not be for me. It has a lot to do with your time in life, the nature of your loss, what's going on when your loss or losses were there, all kinds of things. And then there's a time frame. Typically, the younger you are, the longer you're going to grieve. Why? Because you're younger. And there's something to be said for that. And then there's that phrase, get over. You don't get over. You go through it, you grow through it, hopefully. But it's not something that, with a shot or with medicine or with time, you eventually get over. A fellow by the name of Dennis Kloss was talking about this concerning loss. He said, time can lessen the hurt. The empty space may seem smaller as other things and experiences fill our life. We may forget for periods and feel as if our loss did not die. We can feel sense in the death and understand that perhaps the death does not fit into a bigger design in the world. But we can't get over it, because to get over it would mean we were not changed by the experience. It would mean that we did not grow by the experience. It would mean that the loss made no difference in our life. Then he goes ahead to discuss the Talmud. The Talmud was sort of a Jewish commentary of life in the BC era. Not biblical in the sense of inspired by God, but also just basically how they dealt with things. And there was a loss, and they go to the elders of the town, and they said, I'm wearing this garment to express my grief. Can I wear it for a period of time outwards so that people can know by the nature of this garment that I've lost someone? They said yes. Then later on came back and said, after a period of time, is it okay for me to do something with that garment? Can I sell it to someone else? And they said, no, it has to be yours. In other words, you have to own your grief. It's not something that you can just pass on to someone else. It's something that you have to deal with. And so just to understand that there's not a time frame, you're not going to get over it, but you're going to go through it and hopefully grow through it is important. Number two, all bereaved people grieve in the same way. Completely false. There's no way for us to understand. Even if we had the same loss, still there would not be that understanding, because we're going to grieve differently, and we just need to understand that. Number three, children grieve in ways that are different than adults. The answer is true. Sometimes children are referred to as forgotten grievers. The reason for that is that a lot of times in our emotions and making things ready for the funeral itself, we tend to forget that they too have lost. Now, here's the rule of thumb. If you're old enough to love, you're old enough to mourn. A 3-year-old can love, can they not? Sure they can. They may not be able to articulate it, put it into words, they may talk about, my tummy's hurting. Because what they're trying to say is, I'm hurting, but I really don't know a whole lot why. But I see mommy and daddy crying, and I see grandpa and grandma crying. And so I feel sad too, even though I really can't put it into words. Some years ago, I did a funeral for a mother that in our area, she had gone on that Friday night to buy the school supplies for her children, and she went to sleep that night telling her husband and her children good night, giving them a kiss, and she didn't wake up in the morning. 46-year-old young lady who had a heart defect, and they didn't realize it, and she died. I had coached her son's basketball team, I believe the 4th or 5th grade. And so they asked me, because also she was related to somebody in the church where I preached, to do the funeral. I'd never seen or heard a 10-year-old wailing, but that literally was what he was doing. They almost had to carry him out of the funeral home at the very end. Just so sad. About 20 minutes later, we've gotten to the cemetery. And as I pull up, I see this boy, the same boy that they literally almost had to carry out because he was just, beside himself, and rightly so. This is his mom. And this same little boy is out there with some cousins, and they're kicking rocks there in the cemetery. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. This is the same boy and what happened? And the point was this. Unlike us, its grief is 24/7, children don't have that capacity. And so he had to go back to being a boy for a little period of time. Was the thought there that his mom had still died? Oh, yes. But he went back to being a little boy. And so just because we don't always, they call it hit and run. Children will hit and run. By that I mean they may say, "No, what happened to Grandma?" And then and then they go back and they're out there in the yard playing with their friends, or on whatever the case may be, their tablet or whatever the situation is. They're not like us, ready to talk about it for a 30-minute period of time. That's just not much. That's not possible for them. But they may articulate it through drawing. They may articulate it through short-term discussions. You may see them one time being mean to their dog, and you think, what is wrong with them? Well, that's their way of acting out the feelings that they have because they don't know how to do it like others. But children need to be involved in the grief journey. And so we need to understand that if there is a loss, we don't need to forget them. 44% of children find out about the death of someone significant in their family because they saw or heard adults discussing it over in the corner. In other words, they didn't even tell them that grandmother had died. And so it's really, really important. I did a funeral one time up in Loretta, Tennessee. It's just right across the Tennessee line from where we live there in Green Hill, Alabama, outskirts of Florence. And this lady was a high school teacher there at Rogers High School. Wonderful lady. She had 6 children. Husband was still living. And so they asked me to do the funeral. I met with the 6 siblings and their mates and the father and just asked them, what would you like folks to know about your mother? About Mrs. Truitt. And they talked about her. And they told me things that were so important to her and her love for God and such like. And then I said, with your permission, I'd like to talk to your children. They said, oh, we'd like for you to. There were 18 of them. I mean, we were in the back of the music room of that funeral home chapel, and they were just all around the wall there, from age 6 to 24. And I just asked the open question, what would you like folks to know about your grandmother? And then they just started talking. It was just like the floodgates had opened. Somebody had asked the question that they wanted, and they wanted to be able to tell. And they told about all these neat things that she had done and all the things that were special to her. And especially the thing that I liked most was But they had a golf cart there on the farm, and she was always riding them around the golf cart. And they said one day in the summertime it overheated, and it began to smoke, and you should have seen her throwing us off that golf cart. And then she went over and she dug in the earth, and she started throwing dirt on that fire, and it went out. Guess what I told at the funeral? That story. Because it wasn't how she died, but how she lived that made it so important. So we just need to be sure that we keep that in mind. Ron, you were going to say something?
Yeah, is this working? Imagine that each one of us have what we call a grief box. Obviously, ours would be large. A child's small. And when they finish filling up their grief box, dealing with whatever kind of grief loss there may be, it's full. They're done. That's why they get back to doing whatever it is that they were doing or want to do beforehand. So that explains why a child can only deal with a subject so much. Our mom died 2.5 years ago. About 4 months ago, 2 of our 3 grandchildren were at our house. And my wife was just listening to Claire and Lily talk. And just out of the blue, Lily said, "You know, Claire, Mama Dot's up there in heaven." And Claire said, "Yeah." And said, "You know, we want to go to heaven when this life is over so we can go be with Mama Dot." And Claire said, "We sure do." And Lily said, stops for a pause for a second, "We don't want to go to that other place. What's that place called?" And Claire said, "I don't know, but we don't want to go there either." But see, that just came out of the blue. I mean, they were not talking about anything related to that. So that's what Don was referring to. When it comes to grief in children, they'll bring it up at what you think are the strangest moments. But it's just, as they're coming through their day-to-day situation, something will pick, and just listen, let them go. And then very quickly, they went right back to doing whatever it is that they were doing and talking about whatever they were talking about. So that's what he's referring to there. But the difference is whatever their grief box is, in their mind, it can only, it's small. And so when they're done, at that point in time, they're done. So you as a parent, as a caregiver, as someone who loves them, you can't say, "Well, let's talk about that." No. It may have already been gone. The moment's gone then. But, the children look at, the rainbow in the sky. Children see a newly dug grave. Children see someone that's sad because their loved one is no longer there. And that's when they'll key in on it for a moment and then move away. But I just wanted to mention that in regard, because we had this discussion last weekend where we were, and there was an individual in the back of the room. He had one of those V8 moments, and he said literally, he said when you said that, he said it just like he said that explained why one of his children was exactly the way they were in regard to dealing with grief, because the other 2 were sort of like he and his wife. The third child, no way. And he said it made such a difference in the way I perceived and understood who they were and what they were going through, because that's exactly what she had done. So I just wanted to mention that before, while we were talking about this particular discussion.
I knew of a lady who tells a story that at their funeral, there was the casket and it was open, and unbeknown to her, one of the little grandchildren was over on the side just sort of writing something down. She didn't know what it was, and later on, he had drawn a picture of Granddaddy in the casket, and he gave it to his grandmother, and she said, I cherish that because that was his way of doing something to help her and himself at the same time. Another friend, a lady, came to our grief class, and I knew her husband, good man, used to teach Bible classes, and he had died suddenly of a heart attack, laying in his recliner. And at the funeral, there was a 10-year-old granddaughter that was just sort of moving around and just sort of spinning around and stuff like that. And she just thought, why would she act that way at the funeral, right sort of in front of the casket where her granddaddy was? And she said it bothered her as the wife and the grandmother that this granddaughter was sort of acting out, or so she thought. And she went over to her and she said, what are you doing? She said, well, you always know that when we came to your house that we would have a show and tell, and we would do something that we'd been doing at school. And she said, you knew that I took lessons for twirling around, and so she said, I was doing this twirling in honor of Granddaddy. And she said, I was so glad that I didn't say something of a negative nature, that this was her way of honoring her Granddaddy by moving around in the way that she was. Just need to understand that part. In the book, Walking with Those Who Weep, that Ron and I wrote back in the back, the longest chapter deals with the loss of children. Okay, number 4, holidays and anniversaries of death and or losses get off great amounts of anguish and pain. Very true. Every year, at least 8 million people look at the holidays for the very first time without their loved ones. And also, millions of others wish that the calendar would stick from November 1st all the way over to January 2nd, so you don't have to deal with Thanksgiving and Christmas. Another chapter in that book deals with holidays and anniversaries, and we just understand that those are difficult times, and all you can do is get through them. That's all you have to do. I mean, just try to get through them. They may not be enjoyable at first, but that's a whole different subject, but at the same time, just understand that they do have those things. Number 5, the threat of divorce is a real probability after a child dies. Probability is the answer, is the key word here. Possibility, definitely. Probability, let me give you the statistics. We all know someone who has lost a child, and in time to come, the marriage is over as well. The Compassionate Friends is a national organization. Probably, what's the biggest city in Mississippi from here? Jackson. Jackson probably has a Compassionate Friends organization. You can go online and sign up that way. It's completely free. They deal with 2 kinds of losses. The loss of a child at any age and the loss of siblings, brothers and sisters. They did a study in 1999 asking 600 couples, years after the death of your child, what's your marital status? 75% of them were still married. 14% were widowed. They had lost their mate after the death of those children. 12% had divorced, but of the 12%, only 4% said that the death of the child had anything to do with the death of their marriage. They reaffirmed that study again some 10 years later, and basically the same figures. So, there can be a lot of reasons for the ending of a marriage. And if you don't have a strong marriage, it can make it harder. The book that I wrote, Hope for Those Who Struggle, that's out there as well. There's 3 chapters on the loss of a child. And the 3rd chapter deals with the marriage after the loss of a child. In other words, what husbands and wives can do to grieve together and not grieve separately, and to make sure that they continue to do the best they can and grieve in a positive way with each other, as opposed to not grieve. Sometimes The fear is this. The husband may say, well, I've got to be strong for my wife, so I won't grieve and be around her because it'd make her sad. And she may think, well, I don't need to grieve in front of him because that's going to make him sad, and he's got to go on to work and whatever. And so the end result is they don't grieve. They don't show any grief to one another, and they're thinking, well, he doesn't care. She doesn't care. And then that can cause problems. There's a really good book called Are You Weeping With Me, God? By Martha Biddle Clark. And in that, she talks about she lost a 21-year-old daughter in a car accident. And she's talking about how that she was grieving throughout the day while her husband was away. And yet, when he came in, she'd have on that, the face with the makeup and look and smile and everything because she didn't want to add to his burdens. And he would, they'd eat and then they'd go to sleep and they didn't talk about anything. And she never saw him talk about their daughter. And she just thought, he doesn't care. One day she went to work, and his office was sort of in the inner part. And so on the outer part, she looked and saw that all the pictures of his daughter was right around him on the table, and that he was right in the midst of it. And he had his head on the desk just crying his eyes out. She said, here's where he's grieving. He's afraid to grieve in front of me to make me sad, and yet this is where his grief was. That was his grief room, as we talked about last night. And so they finally were able to get on the same page. But possibility, yes, but it doesn't have to be probability. Number 6, losing someone to sudden death is the same as losing someone to an anticipated death. False. We need to make sure, as we said last night, death comes in one size, extra large. But at the same time, we don't categorize a person who passes away in a nursing home as the same kind of death as a person that dies suddenly in a car accident, or to a disease, or sadly even to COVID. It's just entirely different situation. And we need to understand, and this is sometimes is a whole discussion. And again, Walking with Those Who Weep, there's a chapter on this, sudden loss versus anticipated loss. With sudden loss, I was a chaplain for Lauderdale County Sheriff's Department there in Florence. There were times they called me, Don, there's been a drowning, there's been a shooting, there's been a car accident, there's been a heart attack. Need you to put your uniform on, the officer's going to come pick you up, and you need to go to this address and talk to this family. It was sad to think about that, in a matter of 20 minutes or so, I was going to have to give them information that was just going to shake their life. But hopefully, we could do it in the right way, and then at the same time be able to be of some help to them after the fact, as the case may be. But so there are times when sudden, unanticipated losses come, and there's nothing to fall back on. There's so many questions and not enough answers initially. And it's going to take time, and in some cases you may not even be able to find all the answers that you're looking for, because that doesn't seem real. A person can be in shock and numbness for a great period of time. So if you know of someone, or if you're in a situation where you're dealing with a sudden, unanticipated loss, be good to yourself, because it's going to take a while. And others who are trying to be with them in their grief journey need to understand that this isn't something that's going to get better in a period of time, because there's so much going on. Met a lady last week, Gadsden, and she had lost a loved one due to the disease that plagues so many. And I just thought, I can only imagine what you're feeling because of what she's going through, and yet there she was, and I was grateful that she was a part of it. But we just need to understand, from a church's point of view, somebody says, well, they're not coming to church services like they are, or they just seem to be so distant. Well, again, think about what they're having to deal with. Think about what they're having to try to get up and do. And it's just going to take longer. It's sort of like the idea of you're walking down the road and somebody comes up from behind and hits you. You never saw it, you didn't hear it, and then all of a sudden you're on the ground. Versus a person coming at you and you see them and you sort of brace yourself and they still hit you and they still knock you down, but at least you saw it coming. A person in the nursing home or a person who's had an illness for a long, long period of time doesn't mean that we're ready for it. There's that battle of the heart versus the head. You know, the heart, there's another cure. There can be another surgery. There can be another medicine that can help. The head, I see the demise of the person. I hear what the doctors say. We've done all that we can do. It's in the hands of God. Whatever the case may be, that battle takes place with everyone because we're so much about living. Any questions or any comments about that or anything else before we continue?
I think with a sudden death, it's something that you have nightmares that it's a nightmare, and it goes for a long time.
Yes, ma'am.
But you don't feel like it's real. My husband died 7 years ago, and my children found him. So they had their own, they were 11 and 12 years old.
Wow.
So you think that they don't grieve, but they wrote a letter saying about what they loved about their dad.
Yes.
And they read it at the funeral. But later on, when they got a little older, they came in the house and told me that somebody took them to the graveside, and they went by and got a pizza and sat down at the grave and ate pizza with their dad.
Oh.
And they left him a piece of pizza.
Isn't that sweet? That is precious.
You know, you see things like that, and they still grieve.
Yes.
And it's, I think a lot of it is because they were the ones that found him.
Right. Right.
And I was looking at having heart surgery in the next few weeks, and I thought it was me that was going to pass,
Right.
not him.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And it was 3 days before Christmas.
Mm.
So that added to everything.
Add to everything, definitely. Well, thank you for sharing that, and I'm certainly sorry for your loss.
No, it was a hard year. I
Yes.
lost my dad in January, my grandmother in July, and my husband in December.
Mm.
So it was a very hard year.
Very true. Very true. And a lot of times people just don't understand all that. They call that cumulative grief, where you've got one, and before you can even begin to work with that one, you've got this other one, and they just keep on piling up. And it takes longer and longer to process that, much less to work through it, because you've got all these all at the same time. I knew a lady who, in 9 months' time, developed cancer, lost her job, and lost her husband through divorce. And she couldn't, she's dealing with 3 big things there. And yet, all in a 9-month period of time, you begin to wonder what's going to happen the next day, because that was just so much. And so we just need to understand that with sudden, unanticipated losses, there can't be the normal responses because you don't have anything to go on. And it's just going to take much longer to process it. And sometimes even when you seek to find the answers, you don't find the answers. Sometimes doctors don't give you all the information that they need to. Or sometimes in situations a person does not know. I mean, in suicide, typically on average a third will leave behind a note. But the note may or may not even have anything to do with the reason why they chose to do what they did. And so that makes it that much harder. Or think about 9/11. 3,000 people that were going to work, and look what happened. And it just is a whole gamut of emotions that are completely different. And So it's really important for us to understand that it's not the same, and that people do need a lot of patience, and people who are trying to help them need to understand that this is going to be a lot longer journey, and that we need to be there with them in the long journey, because as they try to go through that and such like.
I think with children, if you have children and there's a loss, like a parent, a grandparent, I think people need to get counseling for themselves and the children. And I regret that I didn't do that.
There's a lot of value in that. Ron is a counselor as well, and has a degree in counseling, and it is very important to do that. And somebody pointed out recently to me something that I thought of. If a person died, whether it was an anticipated loss or a sudden unanticipated loss, one meaningful thing that somebody might do is, if they knew that person who died suddenly, write a note or a letter to the grandchildren or the future grandchildren about that person as to who they were. In other words, you may have never known your granddaddy, but let me tell you the man that he was. And at a proper time, somebody might pass that letter on to them as a way of only lifting up the memory of the deceased, but also telling future generations, you are who you are because of people like him. And I thought that was a neat thing. Something special like that. Can't bring back the loss, but at least it lifts up the memory. You know, the Bible says in Hebrews 11 verse 4, though he be dead, yet still he speaks. You know, many of you are who you are because of generations that are gone on. And yet they stood for the truth that you did, and they made you who you are. Number 7, an adult will not be affected much if their parent dies. Doesn't matter how old we are, how they are, it's going to impact us. What are the roles that a parent plays in the life of a child of any age? A cheerleader. The first things that you do, they're going to cheer you on. Last night, after I left here, my wife said, call Reese, which is one of our 5 grandchildren. She's got something to tell you. And so I called. She scored her first basket in basketball at age 8. So I had to brag on her for, 150 miles away. Being a cheerleader, I said, well, did you jam it down or did you just? She said, no, I just shot it. I said, okay. Of course, I'm just kidding. But cheerleader. That's what we're there for. What else? What other roles does a parent play in the life of a child? Comforter. Your mentor. They're there for all the firsts in your life, and rightly so. And so it doesn't matter how old you are or how. One lady said, it didn't help me whenever my mother died, and somebody said, you had her for so long. And she thought, yeah, and I'd like for her to be here that much longer. Duh. And that wasn't comforting to me. So we just need to understand that. Number 8, your grief journey will consist of neat stages of feelings and emotions that come in orderly and structured ways. Not at all. In fact, I brought you a picture of grief. And it's a tangled ball of emotions. And we need to understand that it's going to be that way. Can you tell me what's at the center of that? Denial. Denial is very much a part of the grief process. So if we can understand that there's nothing neat about this. We don't use the word stage. I'm walking up this stage and there's 1, 2, 3 steps and I'm here. Well, it's not that neat. A person can be in phases of grief, and you're going to be up and down, and you're going to be in several phases all at the same time, and you may even go backwards sometimes. Some people said, it'd been 3 months, and then they woke up and thought, I just dreamed that it didn't happen. They really are alive. And still, that it goes back and forth. And so we just need to understand there's nothing neat about it. And so that will be helpful to know. Number 9, the words "I know how you feel" can be of great comfort in time of loss. I'll tell you, too many people, 600-700 have been a part of the grief classes over the past 25 plus years, almost 30, have said those words didn't help me. Because I really don't know how you feel. Ron and I are identical twins. We think a whole lot alike, but I truly can't feel everything that he feels, nor me the same way. Even with the same loss. Our father's in declining health. We know maybe a month or so left. Both of us were there last week spending time with him, and we'll be doing that again hopefully soon. But when that, having lost the second parent, and there is a big difference between losing the first and losing the second. I'm finding that out. There may be commonalities, but there may also be differences as well. First grief class I taught was in Guin, Alabama. It's in West Alabama, not too far from here. And there was a couple from Winfield, which is right down the road from there. And they were telling a story about the death of their son that was in a car accident. To make matters worse, the accident happened near their home. To make matters even more worse, they were the ones that found him. So 3 nights later, they're having the funeral. They're having the visitation. Neighbors come to the funeral visitation, and as they are standing beside their son's body, they're in the casket. These neighbors say, "We know just how you feel. We buried our dog last week." And I asked her, "What did you say?" And I thought to myself, she said, "I thought to myself, they just don't understand." Now, animals are important. I'm not trying to negate that. But in no sense is that the same as a human being. And so, what do you say? Well, we're going to talk about that later on, I think, today. But the words "I know how you feel" had a Christian lady who lost 2 husbands to death. One with cancer, another with sudden heart attack. And she said, people would say that to me, and Miss Shirley would say, "I just wanted to poke them." I said, "Well, I'm sure glad you didn't do that." I said, preacher's wife lays out somebody in the foyer, that wouldn't sound too good. But she said, that just bothered me, because she said, they don't know how I feel. Even if they had lost 2 husbands the same way that theirs died, that they weren't married to my husbands. I wasn't married to their husbands. Big differences. So what do you say? Well, I can only imagine what you're feeling. It means I'm trying to, but I know that I can't. One of our ladies used to say, "I don't know how you feel. Can I give you a hug?" And I thought, wow, that ain't any easier. That's the best thing you can do. I don't know how you feel, but I still care. Number 10, disenfranchised grief suggests a loss that either is not publicly recognized due to the relationship, or a loss that is not openly acknowledged or publicly accepted. That's true. That's a big word. If you want to do more study on that, Kenneth Doka, D-O-K-A, came up with that concept. It's a loss where we really don't understand it due to the relationship or due to the nature of the loss. In one sense, COVID is a disenfranchised loss, because in some cases, especially in those times when it was, so rampant, and in one sense, this is pretty rampant too. There were people who couldn't have a regular funeral because of the nature of the time and everything going along with it. And in some cases, you might not even know that a person had died until actually the funeral had passed. And folks aren't able to acknowledge the loss to the family by hugging or by being with them because of all the CDC rules. And that was really hard. or a loss that is somebody at work, is grieving. You say, well, what's wrong? When my stepdad died. Well, you think, well, that's not even your biological dad. Well, what they don't know is that's the only dad you ever knew. So, disenfranchised losses. I'm the director of a children's home. They're in Florence, North Alabama Christian Children's Home. So many of our children don't have the concept of being able to openly acknowledge their grief because in many cases they're away from their parents because of what parents have done. I remember on one occasion, one of the parents' lover, for lack of a better word, mother died. And so they were saying, now is that my grandmother or not? I mean, not the right situation, but they had no choice in the matter. But they were saying, do I need to grieve over this? Was she my grandmother or was she not? Because that's who my dad's with. That type of thing. And so disenfranchised losses. We're not able to openly acknowledge the loss, or we don't understand the loss. Suicide is a disenfranchised loss. A lot of questions, not enough answers. Please, please, please remember there's always innocent family members who are hurting. We don't need to stigmatize what happened by saying, well, I just won't go to the funeral. No, they need your care and support and love more than ever because of the nature. I did a funeral on one occasion of a person who was shot by his wife, and that was the son of one of our church members, and they asked me to do the funeral. And so I began the funeral at the very beginning by saying, we are here to talk about not how he died, but how he lived. I didn't know what happened. The report had not come out concerning what had gone on. So I wasn't about to talk about something I didn't know. But there were some good things in his life. He was good to his parents. He had a daughter. He was kind to others. There were some things that I could say, rightfully so, about him. Because there were so many things you couldn't say because you didn't know. But we need to be sure that we understand that idea. Number 11, lengthy chronic illnesses like Alzheimer's prepare the survivors and prevent complications at the time of loss. Not necessarily. I've had too many people say, Don, I knew that they had been with this disease for 10 years. I knew they weren't going to get better, but on the day they died, I was in complete shock. Again, the battle of the heart versus the head. And so we just need to understand that just because there's a lengthy chronic illness doesn't mean that you're prepared for the loss. And then finally, we're going to take a break after this. Time heals all wounds is true even with the wound of grief. It's what you do with your time. One lady put it this way, you can stop the bleeding, but you can't cover the scars. They're still there. So what do? Well, you come to grief classes like this. You read good books. You become a part of a support group. Maybe in this area there's a grief support group. Things that you can do to sort of help you in your grief journey. Not trying to deal with grief is like trying to cover up cancer with a Band-Aid. You can't do it. It's something you got to do. And so it's what you do with your time that makes it important. Any questions or any comments before we take a break? I've mentioned the two books. Let me mention one other back there that's there. Golden Bubbles is a book written by Edna Butterfield, who is a professor or was a professor at Free-Hardeman University. She lost a grandchild who had a chronic illness, and so that book was written out of those experiences. It's a very, very good book, and we told her that we'd be more than glad to pass it on to others, and so that one's out there available. If you're interested in any of those, there's also a little 10-minute read booklet that you can that we put together about a year and a half ago. Be glad for you to do so. We'll be glad to autograph anything if you choose for us to do that as well. But anyway, let's take about a 10-minute break, and then we will come back and begin to talk about some other things. Again, thank you so much for being here.
There's still coffee and everything in the back.
Still coffee and still those dietetic honey buns out there.
Said I dropped my grape and it rolled off somewhere. I don't think she wants it back. I don't think she had it. That's all. I wish that was sweet. I would. That's no one. Whatever it is, I just need a little bit of caffeine. I always cry.
How do you explain that?
Caffeine's what I need.
Yes, sir.
Dennis Lowell.
What's the last name again?
Dennis Lowell.
Nice to meet you, sir.
We just lost our son in April.
I am so very sorry.
And then you had to start to work today.
How
Hope she likes it. I hope she does too.
was it someone's son?
All the rest of it is.
They found the cancer in the brain.
Oh, shoot.
Somebody did tell me something about someone that it was. Yes. God bless you.
Missing
So,
one son, the wife, she had the virus.
Get out of your life. I just gotta wait till they get
But she's not.
to working.
well, I think they're taking these.
Once they get started, they do very well.
And people say, I know what you're going through.
No,
They're lying. You just want to look them in the eye and say, you're lying.
Well, they mean well, but they don't. That wasn't your son. You know, everybody have different relationships. I'm sure that wasn't their first son. And it wasn't your first son. It was so awesome. Because you had a different relationship with him than they would have with your children. And so that doesn't help. People think that means you help them, but it's really not.
Well, that's the best they know.
Maybe
Yeah,
that's the one
sometimes
thing
it's true.
That's the best they know.
Well, and your son was an elder here?
He was for a number of years, song leader,
He lives in
20.
the Sunday.
Yeah, Brad.
Last Sunday he was here, we led singing, and he explained that he was a little bit busy.
Yeah.
He lost control of that side.
That was the last time he was here.
I'm so sorry.
Brad Dillingham preached for 27 years, and he led the singing for 25.
Yeah. Brad and I were in school together, pretty great guy.
Yeah.
I understand he's taking good care of his mom.
Yeah, he is.
How many children did your son have?
There's 3. 2 of them say their daughters and son.
Yeah.
His son he's a youth director down at Christian Chapel out from Ames.
Okay. Okay.
And he's not here this month. Was he last night?
He was here like a Sunday ago. Was it last Sunday that your brother was here? Or 2 weeks ago?
No, Anna.
Just a few weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
She's a,
And what's his name? You're the one at Christian Chapel. What's his name?
Caitlin. Caitlin Mallett.
Sign those for Hope. Hope. You say Hope. Hope. Tell me about
Our brother-in-law was the minister of Avery,
Yeah, okay.
and that's where our dad
the
is.
custom that you went to. Was it Uganda when you went?
We were in Kenya.
Kenya, okay. And you said you walked in and you sat down.
That happened. It happened so often
Got his,
that we came as missionaries discussing.
and they hired him.
You know, we
He was
came
an
to realize
intern at North Jackson, in
that
Jackson,
that was
Tennessee,
what
where
they,
he was at school.
That's the
what
way
they needed.
That's what they
They
did.
just needed to be there. They just
Interesting.
needed you to be there.
Right. So you didn't even talk about, did they have,
Don't talk about anything, they need to rush into anything.
exactly.
Let's get this over with so I can go do something else.
So there was nothing.
They were totally free to be with you.
Wow.
And that is just a beautiful part of their culture. And they got other things there.
Which makes it that much harder. Wow. Because you can't be there.
They did surgery on him. He died of blood clot. But he had a brain tumor. There's no, there was no, they told us, he said he was there. Every doctor's thought it was a blessing. You know,
How many children do you have, sir?
my daughter lives in Boone. He was 56 on the fourth, and the guy was 7, I think.
She wants to change her major. Well, hopefully next week I can get up
He
there
taught
and do
school
something.
15 years
It's
ago.
gonna be 55 Monday.
The day he
I'm
was,
gonna have to do something soon because we're running out of January.
Brad stood right up there and he said, "This is the largest crowd I've ever
I had to
seen."
talk to him today.
And my son-in-law told us, I ain't gonna convert him on Sunday Street. And, you know, he,
Make sure the slide out comes in.
people
And then
teach
we'll be ready to
people.
get it out. We need to drain a lot water here.
He taught
Pour
Botech.
some antifreeze in.
We had a lot of people who
Oh, he
Drains.
one of his administrators, he lived up 3 or 4, they changed him so often. And he came to us at the Mississippi River, he came to us, and I said, Miss Turner, he said, keep you, just be ready. He was
18 when I got up, when I came out this
This is what
morning.
he's passed.
Well, Terry said it was 16. Terry said it was 16.
10 words.
On my phone it said 18. But you know, it gets colder out in the country.
Suitcase packed. You can be ready, but I'm not prepared.
Yeah.
See?
Yeah.
And David was,
Fix it.
he said he had his back. And I never thought of it like that, but it's meant a lot to me over the years. It's meant a lot. People said, "Please go." I worked in retail sales for 30 years. I preached in 1950s.
I don't read all this. It made me feel worse. And that's what I found.
We run into a lot of things, you know, we talk about suicide. I have a cousin in Oxford. He was sales, a GE.
I was so mad.
His daughter, 16-year-old, got involved in a quote, something that she went back out of shop and said, and all the other family. I didn't know really what to do. He told me about it. He was sure. He contacted me. He told me, he said, my wife's son was in counseling. He said, I didn't know I was an officer. I thought I could handle it. He said, I was wrong. He was a sale. I walked over and told us, I just had to go home.
I know at that time he did have things.
Still,
Very strong. And that encephalitis. And he was
you know,
totally
that's
out.
memories that you have. That's what you do.
That's true. That's true. And all the good things.
His brother.
Thinking of all the people who make it out there have trouble because they
It's awful to you if you don't.
follow them and something to talk to them every day.
I went back there with him at Parker, let him put it on, they had put pads on.
He's, I think they sing up there in heaven, so he's enjoying that part of the choir. But I know it doesn't make it any easier here, especially with stuff.
They temporized me.
Cindy was with him when he died. She called me on Wednesday night. And she was up, I said, he just saw this in the office. She told me that.
I don't know what they give him.
And a doctor told us.
Send it, he can put it on.
It was a blessing.
Well, it
said, we got to get
Camper out of their spot back there.
at least 5. He said, you go. He threw the suitcase back. 2 o'clock in the morning, he said, let's go. I was on line. I was ready and prepared. See, there's a difference there. If some of us look around and want the suitcase, let's go. We don't have time. I mean, a lot of people don't have time. And 5 of those
I mean, I do
there's
love
no
the
difference until the sound of pain. Here comes the problem.
Evidently, she loves to talk to his nieces.
We were ready to go in, but we were not prepared.
Said they was in spots down there. I said, they live all the way up. I said, our campus on the other side. And so then way back down in.
That second chance don't come. I appreciate it. The only way we get out of this world, it just comes. So we need it.
She ain't out of that yet.
Arms in fact.
I am. Hey, sweetheart. She said, where you at? She's supposed to be up yonder, Daddy. Moved on me.
Is Terry back there? I'm not sure.
Moved. I think she's looking for Mama now. She'll be right back. Play with her.
How old is your father?
92.
My mother's 90.
Yeah. I was telling her. Terry, you ready to go? Okay. What we usually do when we think about grief, unfortunately, some people make the mistake of thinking, or at least acting, as if there's only one kind of grief, loss, and that's all. And that, of course, would be what? The loss of an individual. Now, we're not in any way negating that fact because obviously that is a tremendous kind of loss. But you have your handout in front of you. Dr. Peggy Whiting says that a loss is any experience across a lifespan that demands the surrender of something personally significant and or familiar. So here's what we want to do for a few moments. We want to deal with other kinds of losses that produce grief besides the loss of an individual. So I want, and we're going to do a lot of interaction here for just a few moments. Think of some things that produce grief loss in life other than the death of an individual.
Loss of a house.
Property, house, okay? I live in Huntsville, Alabama. It is considered one of the tornado alleys of America. We have particularly there's one neighborhood. You couldn't pay me to live in that neighborhood. They've had all kinds of tornadoes come through there. They come from Mississippi, which obviously they come from Arkansas. They come from, but they just come up that alley past, and they just decimate that area. Well, when you see people's houses destroyed and there's literally, I mean, it's just like an implosion, you typically hear them say, or someone will say, well, it was just a house.
Oh. No.
But think about it.
Memories.
It's the memory inside that house
Yeah. Right.
that made it a home. It's maybe the house that they built with their own hands. They certainly paid for it. So it's more than just mortar and brick and wood and steel, whatever the case may be. It's more than that, just that. And so whenever there's a destruction of, because there's something special about our houses. We live in them. That's why that's why they're special. And so that produces grief loss. and so it's a terrible loss. Other kind of losses. Pets. Why are pets so special?
Part of the family.
Part of the family.
I grieved over a cat. We had it 10 years in Kenya, brought it over here, and it only lasted 2 years.
Wow.
Lawrence thought I had lost a child.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because animals are special. They become a part of the family. They become a part of us. Maybe sometimes there's a double loss when it comes to a pet loss because of the person that gave you that pet, maybe that's no longer here. And so that pet becomes or parts of that relationship. We grew up in Northport, Alabama, and about 8 or 9 years ago, we got a dachshund dog named Heidi. Mom and Dad wished that Don and Cindy and I were as smart as that dog was. Very easy to train, very smart, easy to train to go outside when she needed to go outside. Our dad's was a minister. So we always said that Heidi was the classic preacher's dog. She loved the Word of God. She chewed up 3 Bibles. She was concerned with the souls of men. She chewed up 6 shoes. And on one occasion, she was cleansed and sanctified. She ate a box of X-Lax. It did not. We had her long enough that all of us got married and were able to take Heidi with us for a couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks between Christmas and with Thanksgiving and Christmas. But we all remember the day when Dad and Mom called and said, Dr. Jordan had to put Heidi down today. There were 8 adults bawling their eyes out. Pets. By the way, do you know that pets grieve just like humans do?
Yes, they do.
They really do. Well, it's just a dog. It's just a cat. No, it's that special. I have written sympathy letters to kids whose pets died. I really have, because from their perspective, something tremendously traumatic has happened, and I want them as the minister of that congregation to know, I'm sorry. I feel your pain. Grief loss. What else? Health, definitely. Health. Don't we all take our health for granted until we don't have it anymore? Health. A part of our body that may has to be worked on or even taken off. Health. The lack of ability or the lack of independence now because we got to depend on other people. Health. And how many times, and I'm sure you do just like we do. We want to remember these individuals in regard to their health issues, and we mention their names. Have you ever thought about sending them a card and saying, I cannot imagine, notice the phrase, I cannot imagine
how devastating that must be for you, I want you to know that I'm thinking of you. Because, health issues. That's a grief loss. What else? Job. Yeah. I'm sure this has happened here. I know it happens in Huntsville, Alabama. Someone goes to their factory or some big company or small company, and they get called in at 8:30 in the morning. Thank you so much for your 30 years of faithful service to our country, to our company. We are downsizing, and your job is no longer needed. You have until 12 noon to clean out your locker, and to get off the premises, and the guard will accompany you for the rest of the morning. And here's your severance package. Question: who's going to be grieving that loss? Everybody connected to that. Not just the husband, not just the wife, the kids, the family, the folks who finance their house, the church. Because now you've got issues about going to have to find a job. What if they're at that age, that magic age of, okay, we don't hire people your age anymore. Or we don't think we need to. Job loss. And it happens every day. Not just to the old, to the young as well. That's a terrible grief loss. It really is. What else?
A place.
What?
If you have to move.
Oh, moving, yeah. Move. Let's imagine the following scenario. Mom and dad are getting old to the point that they're no longer able to either take care of themselves or their property, wherever the case may be. All the kids have moved to different places around, and therefore they all come together at a holiday and say, Mom and Dad, you need to move. And here's the choices, Johnny's or me, our house, or you need to move that area. What kind of losses are Mom and Dad going to have when they move away from a home and from a community that they've been a part of for 50, 60 years?
All their efforts they put out.
Everyone that they ever knew, their neighbors, their church, their familiarity with the grocery store, their doctors, the hospital, where they work themselves, and you move them to a totally new perspective, and you're trying to make, and they have to move into usually you typically downsize wherever they move to, so therefore they have to get rid of mementos and things in their house that were there and that was comfortable. And then as someone came and told me, can you go and talk to Mom and Dad? They're not doing too well. I said, what do you mean they're not doing too well? Well, they just seem to be they're very depressed. I said, what's happened recently? Well, we moved them from someplace that they've been a part of for 50 years. Oh. Mom and Dad are grieving. Because something that was significant and important to them has, as it were, by default, been taken away from them. Now, I'm not questioning whether it was a wise thing to do or a needful thing to do. The point of the matter is, do we validate Mom and Dad's feelings in regard to all the things that they're going through? See the point? That's what we got to keep in mind. Other kind of losses. Divorce. Divorce is always a grief loss regardless of the circumstances. I know what the Bible says. I had a lady, a fine Christian lady, that went through a divorce of a man that she had been married to for several years. They had a child together. He decided that he was not happy with their relationship and found someone else.
And so she tried to get him to go to counseling. He sort of laughed about it after a couple of times of counseling and just said, no, I'm not interested. Because of financial situation, she had to live in that same community. And she said, can you imagine how hard it is for me now as a divorced woman living in this community where he had lived all of his life and was well known, as to how hard it is for me to go anywhere knowing that people are talking about me and talking about my idea of intimacy and faithfulness based upon the Bible, and his mockery of all of that in regard to what he's doing with his life. And then she said these words, I would be glad to go and visit my ex's grave. Now, she was not wishing, she was not saying that she was going to make that happen. But she said, I would give anything to be able to go and visit my ex's grave, because then I would have closure. See, that's the point. Several years ago in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, we were talking about this very thing, and I came up with this phrase. It just sort of popped in my brain. Divorce is like having a funeral with an open casket that never gets closed. Anytime you're dealing with a divorce, again, regardless of what the circumstances, but particularly in the one that I described before, it is a terrible grief loss. Does it affect the church? Sure it does. It affects anybody. It's like being in a calm pond and you throw in one little pebble in the middle of it. The rippling effect goes everywhere. Divorce is a terrible grief loss. Other kind of losses. Here's one that you may not think about. Retirement. Now, how in the world could retirement be a grief loss? Imagine the following scenario. The man and the woman have been married together for a lot of years. They both worked outside the home after the kids were raised. But she decided to go ahead and retire early, and she came home to settle in. He kept working. Then he retired and he came home. I'll speak for all you ladies. I have had so many ladies tell me, oh my word, he came home and he sat down expecting me to make everything happy again, because he put all of his value, all of his emphasis on my work that he no longer had, because he decided he wanted to retire. One lady said, I know what I did. I did what to do. I said, what do you do? She said, go back to work. And she did that for a period of time. Huntsville is Redstone Arsenal, and which is part, obviously, NASA, but also part Army. They did a study. A career colonel in the Army that retires after 20 plus years of work with the Army, if he has what they call the type A personality, if he comes home and sits down after 20 years of being in the Army with type A personality, guess how long it will be before he dies?
6 months.
About between a year to 2 years. They cannot come back home and just sit down. And see, we never would think about that for retirement, because retirement is supposed to be happy. But a lot of times it may not be. And I'm not trying to say don't retire. What I'm just saying is, just keep that in mind. That, you need to sort of work out and plan what you're going to do in retirement. And unfortunately, this has happened over and again. People will make their plans for retirement, and then some disaster happens, and everything gets changed almost in the blink of an eye in regard to what has to be done now because of health issues or because of financial setback or because of other things in the family. Other kind of grief losses. Here, what about this one? We're going to call apostasy. A-P-O-S. Apostasy. Unfaithfulness. Someone loses their faith and quits being at church. Apostasy. And I'm sure, just like in any other congregation, you've dealt with that here before. Because I know we dealt with it where I have been. Who's affected by the unfaithfulness of someone in regard to a family unit? Everybody connected to that person. The mom and the dad, the husband and the wife, the son or the daughter, the siblings, the church members. And it hurts, does it not? I mean, I've had parents come and talk to me and said, we were not perfect parents. Has there ever been a perfect parent beside God? No. We did everything we could. We lived before them what we were supposed to live before them. Something happened. What did we do wrong? And most of the time I say, well, likely you did not do anything wrong. Remember free moral agency. Remember the luring nature of the world. Remember the devil's out there as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. But apostasy hurts. It really affects everybody in so many different ways. And it's a continual occurrence. Every single service, you look around and they're not there. And you wonder what you did wrong. And likely you didn't do anything wrong. But the point of the matter is we feel that way. And see, that's a grief loss. That's a terrible grief loss. Other losses. Empty nest. Thank you, ma'am. There's a phenomenon called emptiness syndrome. We raise the kids. We toil, we work, we do everything we can to immerse ourselves into our children. We take care of them. We get them out of high school. We think that we ought to walk the stage with them because we get them to high school. They may go to college. They may go to a trade school. We get them out into the world. And then we look at each other and say, who are you? Yeah, it happens. And then even connected to this idea of the emptiness syndrome is the myth of thinking that the kids will never come back again. They come back. They do. They come back. I'm sorry, what?
Just move to a smaller house.
Yeah. We live here. Half a mile that way is one child. Half a mile that way is the other side. I told my wife, I said, they've got us surrounded. Well, empty nest. And you just have to deal with it. You have to realize it. Yes, ma'am.
We celebrate it. What's wrong with us?
You celebrate exactly.
Something wrong with them?
Yeah, we celebrate it. Exactly. What's that? There's no noise in this house. Oh, wow. But again, it can be a grief loss. It really can. I knew of a couple in South Alabama. They had to reinvent their marriage, literally, because they had put so much stock in taking care and raising their children that they had forgot to take care of their marriage, and they had to work on it. So, empty nest.
What about separation because of war?
Oh, that's a great one. Separation because of war. Again, in Huntsville, because of part at NASA, part Army, there's a lot of folks that come to Fox Theater, the Fox department there, and they're on Redstone Arsenal, and they're there for a period of time, and then they ship out. And a lot of times their families will move into the area, and they don't know how long they'll be deployed. And so there's that separation situation, and family members and children and other such things. I mean, it's, anyone in the military they have my admiration. They have my thanks, and their families, for that very reason. Let me just mention a few others. Loss of credibility. Loss of self-confidence. What about a person that becomes disabled? And I realize that's connected to health. But think about that. Someone that was competent, able to drive, able to do everything, and now because of something that's happened to them, there's the idea of being disabled. Sexual abuse. Alzheimer's or dementia. Mental illness. Anybody ever been robbed or someone broke into your home and stole something? That's a grief loss. It happened to us when we lived down in L.A., Lower Alabama. We were gone on a youth event to Atlanta, and someone broke in. Even scarier, they left us a note on our computer. Did we sleep well those next couple of nights? No.
They broke in when I was in bed.
They broke in when you were in bed. And you feel so violated, so vulnerable, they tore up our kids' toys. And then in the message, they actually complimented us for eating the food that was in the refrigerator, and that they were planning on coming back to get the rest of the stuff. Intimidating, exactly. That's a grief loss. Terrible grief loss. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, what?
A friend of ours in Africa was awakened in the night with a flashlight in her eyes. Her husband wasn't at home. And I have thought of that, and it almost gives me a heart attack every time.
We had church members that were walking into their house after midweek Wednesday services as someone was running out. Yeah. That lady, one of the church, the wife, she was a basket case for weeks. Because just that very idea of someone violating their home, stealing their, getting the stuff. And again, you can say, oh, it's just things. Yeah, but it was...
Yeah, but it's a loss of security.
It lost the security, exactly.
Because, I got up and went to the restroom, and he was in the house.
Wow.
And I had no idea until the next morning.
Exactly. Extended separation like military, like Don mentioned, abortion, rape, missing person, infertility. You ever thought about that as a loss? Incarceration, PTSD. You see, all of these things produce grief just like the death of an individual. And so the reason we do this is because we don't want you to become so tunnel focused on whatever loss that you're dealing with that you can't be cognizant of all these other losses out there. So we need to validate a lot of people and their losses, because if we don't, we'll just think about it only one way and one way only. I think your outline says what everybody needs to know about grief. Let's look at that one for a few moments. Grief is a natural and healthy consequence that should occur when a loss has occurred in your life. Key words there, natural and healthy. Now, we live in a world today, unfortunately, that says what? It's not natural and it's unhealthy. Unfortunately, out there, and I don't care where they live, whether it's Mississippi, Alabama, New York State, or wherever, there are people that have this idea that grief is something that you ought to be able to get over, you ought to gut it up, and you ought to be quit talking about it after a period of time. Okay. Is there anybody here from Ohio? I didn't think so. They did an informal survey. This is literally what they did. They went to a little town in Ohio several years ago. They sat on a street corner on a busy day, and they said, we'd like to take a survey. They surveyed 250 people from that town in Ohio, and they asked them this question. If you were dealing with the loss of a husband or a wife, a mother or a dad, or a son or a daughter, which of course typically those are the closest relationships we have in life, how long do you think it would take for you to get over those losses? They surveyed 250 people. I'd like for you to think about a time frame that these 250 Ohioans came up with in regard to the answer to that question. I'm going to take different people ages. Yes, ma'am? What would you guess that they said? The majority of them said one answer. What do you think it would be? How long? Just guess. Forever. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I would have said never.
Never.
That's what
Okay. Sir, let's ask you. Right here in the blue, I love that white and blue shirt. What would you say? Give me a time frame. Was it weeks, months, years? Weeks? Okay. What would you say, Mom?
I would say never.
Never. What would you say? The consensus of 250 people from that little town in Ohio said they felt like that dealing with mom and dad, husband, wife, son and daughter, it would take them somewhere from 2 weeks to 2 months.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Don't show how much love they have, just.
Yeah. Okay. So, exactly. So the only way that I could even that is, I mean, just does not even make sense. But but they had to have talked to 250 people that had really never actually had a loss, or did not have a very good relationship with their people around them. Exactly. But see, unfortunately, 1 out of 5 people that you meet have even a clue about dealing with grief and loss. 1 out of 5. Which means that when you're dealing with your loss, whatever it may be, you're going to get 1 person out of 5 that basically will say, I understand somewhat what you're going through. The other 4 are varying degrees of ignorance or indifference. Now that's sad. But the point of the matter is, that's the way some people in our world look at grief. We had I know of a lady who
lost her adult child in a sudden, terrible accident situation. And she was told after 2 months, ma'am, your negativity and your grief is smothering us here at work. You either need to change, get better, or we're going to have to just let you go. Can you just imagine being told that by an employer? I think that would probably be what I would consider to be a good lawyer lawsuit. But still, she said, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. She said the very idea that they would say, yeah, okay. A natural and a healthy consequence. 2, grief affects a person with their whole being, emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Emotionally, what are some of the signs? Crying, sadness, anger, want to be alone, isolation. Emotionally. And see, this is why grief is so debilitating. Because, I mean, think about it. Something that can control both your head and your heart, that's what grief is. Physically, how does grief affect a person physically, or how can it? Don't feel good. Just have this sickness in my stomach. Just sort of in a fog. Just get up in the morning and just the whole world's sour. Can't sleep. Give up. That's all you want to do is sleep. Can't eat, or just the opposite. That's all you want to do is eat.
It basically changes your whole routine.
I'm sorry, what?
It basically changes your whole routine.
It does change. They did a survey. If a widower, if a man loses his mate, then after he deals with the initial loss itself, the next 12 months, he can be very vulnerable in regard to his immune system. Women, 18 to 24 months after the loss. Now, and the only difference that I could figure out from that was that typically women, you ladies are so superhuman when it comes to the way you deal with grief and the way you're trying to make sure everybody else then that's the reason it's 18 to 24 months is because you got to take care of everybody else before you take care of yourself. At least that's what you many times choose to do. But there's just something you need to remember. That there's the tendency, there's the possibility. Man, after 12 months or 12 months or so, women 18 to 24 months. Immune system is not going to be what it needs to be. Mentally, can't think straight. Cognitive distortion. Just can't remember things. Did I pay this bill? Paid that bill twice. Did I ever pay that bill? Losing things. Just can't operate. Spiritually speaking, how can grief affect a person spiritually speaking? I'm sorry, what?
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Why not?
Why not? We don't have all the time to talk about where God is in our grief. But a lot of times I've heard of people that said, they walk into a church building and it's hard to focus on what we do in that church building because of the loved one that's no longer there. The opposite is also true. I had a lady in one of my grief support classes. Her husband was a deacon of the church. They'd been missionaries for a number of years and just had a wonderful relationship. When he had died, she said,
it dawned on me one Sunday when I got ready and I walked into the same building where he had lived, where he had served, and where we worshiped together, that I was the closest this side of heaven to him now than I would ever be. He's with the Lord in a special place. I'm on this side of eternity, but I'm the closest to him that I will ever be. Wow. What faith. What a way of thinking about that. But just understand that grief can affect us spiritually speaking. Yes, sir.
One of the things that I've noticed in the Psalms is that it's all right to rail against God.
Wednesday night in our Bible class study, we talked about laments. And the book of Psalms is about 1/3 of the book of Psalms deal with a lament. A lament is a statement of protestation against something that is going wrong. And you bring it up before God, and it's raw, it's real, it's sort of in your face kind of thing, because a person is hurting. Most of the time it was written by David. But David would say, Lord, this is what's happening to me. Where are you, Lord? I mean, that's called a lament. And God can take it. He's not the, David wasn't the first one that ever wondered where God was. Who was it? Jephthah in Judges said, Lord, if where are you? Because if you're here and you care for us, then why are we dealing with all these adversity? Why do we have all these enemies surrounding us? Where are you, Lord? 3, grief is always an individual matter. You never know how a person grieves. There are no two flakes the same. They're all different. We all grieve differently. 4, it's a multifaceted emotion. There's no real stage-by-stage progression. Huntsville is known as Rocket City, USA, because that's where we built the rocket that took man to the moon in 1969. If you've ever been to Huntsville, Alabama, and you're going by 565 there at the Space and Rocket Center, you'll see you'll see literally the mock-up of the 5-stage rocket, 363 feet high, right there in front of you, and you literally can see stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. They all had to work in order for the man to get to the moon. Grief doesn't work that way. It is not neat, divine, well-defined package. That's why we like phases, as Don said, because you move in and out of phases, and they change from time to time. You can be more than one phase at a time. So that's why we just like to use the word phase instead of stage. I know about Kubler-Ross and her 5-stage model of grief. She said later on, I never meant that to be the only understanding of grief. Number 5, grief can be a result of many kinds of losses. That's what we just talked about. Number 6, a person's feeling of grief will be directly affected by the significance of that loss. Okay, here's the illustration. Likely tomorrow morning, someone's name that is of this congregation will be mentioned concerning sickness. If that was the case, Don and I would be saying, well, we're sorry to hear that. But we have no connection to that person aside them being a member of this church. Now, if we got a call of someone from Huntsville, Alabama, or someone from Florence, Alabama, that Don and I know well, and something bad happened to them, which one of those two situations would we be directly affected by? The latter, the one that we have the relationship with. The closer you are to the relationship, the greater the potential, the feeling of loss and grief. As I already mentioned, husband, wife, mom and dad, brother, sister, maybe sibling, those are the closest relationships we have in life. The closer we are, the greater the potential. And so we got to remember that. And and not let people say, well, it was just your dad. I mean, after all, he was 92 years old. Yeah, I know. But he's the only dad we ever had. And he's done everything we could ever imagine. And then, so you see the point. Number 7. Once a person has dealt with some loss in their life, they're not to be the same person again. Grief changes us. For a period of time, it may make us seem a little bit selfish. But you know what? That's okay. If you don't take care of yourself and your grief, who is? Seriously, who is? If you get on a plane and they go through all the safety stuff at the very beginning of before they take off, what do they say about the oxygen mask if they fall down during some kind of emergency? Put your mask on first and then help others. The same is true in regard to grief. You take care of yourself so that then you can go and take care of someone else. Number 8, there are no real set time limits. One does not ever get over grief. Don mentioned Therese Rando, and she says in her book, as long as people grieve more normally, they can and they will grieve for a lifetime, and that is okay. Think about the relationships we have. Think about how long we have had those relationships. And one way or the other, we can and we will grieve for a lifetime. And that's all right. That's certainly appropriate. Now we're going to change in our grief as we grow through grief. But we're going to be okay in that regard. And it's all right to grieve. I did a funeral for a man that was 99 years old. He had been married to his wife for 74 years when he died. And then she died a few years later on. And I told her, I said, you had 74 years with a man that you loved and that he loved you. You grieve as you will. You feel what you feel. Don mentioned a few moments ago the books that we have, the display. Let me just quickly mention. 3 years ago, a friend of ours came up to us or called us and said, hey, there's not anything modern that's dealing with grief loss in regard to a tract or a brochure form. What you folks are going to do about it? So we got busy in October of 2019, and wrote this. It came out the week before Freed Hardeman Lectures in February of 2020. And we had it at the lectures to give out to loving folks, to let folks see about it, order it to use for their churches and such things. And then 3 weeks later, COVID hit. So obviously, we went through the first publishing. We just published a brand new batch a couple of weeks ago. But this would be a great little track for you to have to give to a neighbor, to a friend, entitled, How Can I Help Myself and Others in Time of Grief? It's just something you can just say, hey, I know these guys, this is yours. In case and we sell them in bundles for churches and such things, but this is $1 a piece. This is the first book that we wrote in 1996, Walking with Those in Grief, with Those Who Weep. It's in its 9th printing. This is what we call Grief 101. If you just wanted a general book to have for yourself or for someone else dealing with just different aspects of grief, this would be our recommendation. This is the book that Don wrote in 1999, Hope for Those Who Struggle. It deals with specific kinds of losses, loss of a child, loss of a parent, loss of a mate, loss through miscarriage, loss of a stillbirth, deals with loss of a friend. I think there's one in there as well. But anyway, specific kinds of losses. Then this is the book that Donna mentioned a few moments ago, Golden Bubbles by Sister Edna Butterfield. It deals with a grandmother's perspective of a granddaughter, small granddaughter, that had a rare form of cancer. And Miss Butterfield did a tremendous job with this little book. There's some excellent chapters in there. But, and again, we're selling this for her because she didn't have any way to promote it. So if you're at all interested, obviously you can write either cash or a check to Rondine Books, and Don will be back there in just a moment when we take a break in case you're interested in any kind of way. So let's take about a 5-10 minute break. Yeah, we're gonna get you out of here before 12 noon. That's our promise to you, to get you out. The next session we're gonna be talking about why people say what they say, how terrible they are sometimes in that regard, and then what to say instead of that. Let's take a couple minutes break. Thanks. Okay. I think the next handout you have in front of you deal with actual losses versus our comments versus what to say. Why is it that people do not say the right thing to people in grief? They don't know what to say.
They think they have to say something.
They think they have to say something. Okay, where did they pick up what they say to others in grief?
It's been said to them, they've heard it.
Something that they've heard. A lot of times we pick up comments made at a funeral home situation, and we say, oh, that's good, I'll say that next time. Regardless of whether it fits or not, they think they have to say something. Yes, ma'am.
Also take cues, I think, from like church service, what we know we're supposed to know about grief. That God's supposed to be there for our comfort, and we know that.
Right.
We also don't have to be reminded that they're in heaven and that we have a chance to go there.
Right.
Because they're not here right now.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's what we need.
Exactly. We'd like to have someone with skin on. We really would. So, unfortunately, we're uncomfortable ourselves, and so therefore we say something to someone, regardless of whether it makes sense or not, because we think we have to say something. And see, I think I know the answer to this question. How many of you have ever attended a workshop that told you or that talked about things to say or not to say? Yeah, I didn't think so. And that's not, and you're not abnormal. You're the standard. No one else has either, for the most part. So, throughout the years, as you have there in front of you, I have collected, and it's more than just 42. But I've collected things that people said that were inappropriate, that did not make sense, that did not help, that did harm, in fact. So here's what I'd like for us to do. Let's just stay on the first page for right now. 1 to 30, is that right? Yeah. Okay, somebody just pick out a number and let's talk about it for a moment.
Number 26.
Number 26. Wow. Years ago, I was at a workshop in Montgomery, Alabama, and it was this was before a lot of technology was out there, and so what they were doing is they were gathering us. We came into Montgomery to Alabama Auburn's program, and they were doing a live feed from Washington, D.C., where they had all these experts dealing with grief, talking about various subjects. And we were there at one of the feeds, one of the sites to view this. After they had finished their presentation, and these were all folks with PhDs and all kinds of stuff that had been there, they had a call-in show. People could call in and ask questions live on the air. And so we're there, and I'll never forget, I was sitting there watching these experts on a live feed in Washington, D.C., and this lady came over the air, and she said, we need to talk to people in the insurance field to be more cautious and careful what they said. And the moderator said, ma'am, would you please explain? She said, my son tragically died in an accident, and last week I got a call from an insurance agent saying, you're going to have to convince me that your child was worth $50,000. The cameras went on these experts. Every one of them did this. They were shocked. Finally, one of them got their composure and said, ma'am, we are so sorry that someone would have said something so terrible to you. And yes, you're right. We need to do a better job of educating people about dealing with these situations. Can you just imagine? And they went on to talk to this lady again. You know, all they had was phone line. This was several years ago. But they just said, we are so sorry that you had to go through that. And I'm afraid today, you would hope it would be better, but some people are so callous. Another one, 11. Oftentimes when parents cannot have children or when they cannot successfully bring them to term, miscarriage, stillbirth, someone will say, as if to encourage them, well, at least you can have other children in time. What's wrong with that statement? Number one, you're assuming something that may not be the case. Number two, you're not validating the loss that they are dealing with at that point in time. So that's what's wrong with that statement. So you don't assume something when you're dealing with grief. Grief is too much a emotion-filled subject that you try to assume something. You cannot assume that. Another number. What? 3. It must have been God's will. Isaiah 55:89. God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are greater than our thoughts. And in the passage, what Isaiah says in that passage is, since God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts and his ways are greater than our ways, then how can we as human, finite individuals understand the infinite, all-knowing will and mind of God? To assume that a tragic situation took place and that was God's will, unfortunately, puts God on the wrong side of the ledger. Because there's a tremendous difference between what God causes and what God allows. God allowed 9/11. He did not cause 9/11. The devil did. And those who followed him that were willing to get in planes and do what they did to kill 3,000 innocent individuals. That was not the will of God. In fact, I like to think that when something tragic happens in life, whether it's right here, right now, in Corinth, Mississippi, or in Huntsville, Alabama, or in New York City, that God's the first one to cry when something terrible happens in regard to humanity misusing their free moral will and agency. Unfortunately, using God's will, or it must have been God's will, is assuming way too much, and I don't think we have the right to do that. I think people say it sometimes with the idea in mind, you don't need to question this terrible thing and blame God, because after all it was God's will. But see, there's something stinking about that theology. That's not the way it works. James 1:17 says that every good gift and every perfect gift comes down from above. That just means God's good. He's good all the time. And therefore, for that reason, don't allow someone to take God and to make him a tyrant, or to make him to, I forgot which number it is. Where's the one about, number 7. God must have needed. Folks, what does God need from us? Absolutely nothing. He is all-knowing. He's all-powerful. He's omniscient. Paul on Athens Hill, Mars Hill in Athens, said that God made the world and he does not need anything from us. So therefore, when someone says, well, God must have needed a little child for his choir in heaven. Oh, don't get me started. Please, let's not do that. Because you see, in grief, spiritually speaking, when we're dealing with grief issues, people tend to be a little bit isolated, they're a little bit disconnected. My job and your job as people that care and love is to connect them back to God, to the church, to Christians, to whatever. And everything that I say and how I act, and Don will say more about this tomorrow, but all the things that we do need to connect people back to where God is. Let's be careful about that. But thank you for mentioning that one. Another number, 5. You have to be strong for. Moms, I was going to say you're the best and you're the worst. You want to make sure everybody around you and your family circle are doing okay. I know that. That's just ingrained in you, I think probably from God. But when you say you have to be strong for, it's like you're putting more responsibility, more stress, more overload of grief on that person as you try to pretend to be strong so that you can help other people. I was doing a funeral for a man that died, a father that died suddenly. He had a 12-year-old child. The funeral home director knew this family quite well and knew the child quite well. And I actually heard him say these words. Now, son, you're going to have to be the man of the house, and you're going to have to gut it up and keep going. Thankfully, after that funeral home director went about his many duties that day, I pulled that child aside and I said, son, you're 12 years old. You be human. You cannot assume your dad's responsibility. You cannot assume his role. You just do what you can do. Yes, I know you want to help your mom. Yes, I know you want to help your siblings. But your daddy never meant for you to become the man of the house. Don't do it. So when we say you have to be strong for, we're, as it were, putting more responsibility on them. But then secondly, we're also saying what? You don't feel what you're feeling. You don't be human in this regard. That's not right. That's wrong. So that's what's wrong with that statement. Another one. 6. Yeah, God took him or her and is testing you. You know, this idea, the Bible tells us that God's not a respecter of persons. Paul said that on Areopagus, Mars Hill, Acts chapter 17. He said that in regard to in Acts chapter 10 when Cornelius and his household were being saved. That he had to, the Lord had to convince Peter, I mean this. Even though these are unclean animals, there's a reason where I was trying to get you to realize that if I say it's okay, it's okay. God's not a respecter of persons. So this idea of God snatching people, that's bad theology. That's just not the way it works. I know Hebrews 9:27 says, and it is appointed to man to die once, and after that the judgment. But that's just, it's open-ended. Yes, unless the Lord comes again, we're going to leave this life.
People say that was his time.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true.
Well, that's the point. Yeah, we can't assume that was his time. You know, we may come up with financial or medical reasons why a person died or COVID or terrible things, but, I don't think that's the point. Again, God doesn't need someone else in his arsenal up there. Psalm 116:15, precious in the sight of the Lord are the death of his saints. And the way I take that passage is, in the midst of all the other stuff that has taken place, God welcomes them home. In spite of everything else that got them where they were. God says, okay, you're home, and now I'm going to take care of you. Another one.
20.
What?
20.
20. Yeah. I will defer that to tomorrow because Don will talk about that over and over again. But what's wrong with that statement is we put the responsibility on the wrong person. Yeah, and so Don's going to say a lot of different things as to, instead of say, call me if you need me, here's what you need to do. Okay? And so that's, and I think maybe even it's on the second, but yeah, that's, sadly, it can be a cop-out. It really would, because what I've done is I've said, okay, I've checked on you and I told you to call me if you need me. Check off. I can go on about my business. No, you can't. You put the responsibility on the wrong person. And there are things you can do. Another one. 21. Yeah. How's your wife holding up, said to the father of the deceased child? The better question should have been what? First, how are you doing? We had a lady tell us one day that she was dealing with the loss of her husband. It was on Wednesday night, and one of the deacons of the church came, and he took her by the arm, and he said very softly, I want to know, how are you doing? And she said, I'm fine. And he had held her arm on purpose. He said, no, I really want to know, how are you doing? She couldn't handle it. She broke loose and she grabbed she ran outside and she got in her car and she bawled. And then she got hold of herself. And she came back in and she found that man that had asked that question and she said, you really want to know, don't you? He said, yeah. She said, let's sit down and talk. So when we're genuinely concerned about someone, then we're going to ask that question in such a way so that they will know, I really want to know. And I want to know, not because I'm curious. I want to know so I can help. Another number. Number 18. Wow. Yeah, that situation was said in Mobile, Alabama. I was at a workshop. It was a secular workshop. And this particular individual whose son had committed suicide was Catholic. And of course the Catholic faith teaches, or it did then, that if a person commits suicide that there's no way that they'll be able to be in heaven. But can you imagine saying that to someone, a parent? I mean, that's not even a question, it's a statement, but you talk about a jab to the heart. That's just vicious.
The one who judges is God.
What?
The one who will judge that is God.
Exactly.
Not us.
Yes. Yes, the one who will judge that is God. Another number.
15.
15?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I didn't know when someone makes a statement like that, you're just not handling this very well. You're not you're not going through Grief 101 the way you're going to fail this course. I mean, and when someone says that or they insinuate that, my first thought is, number one, how can you understand what I'm going through unless you're in my shoes? And number two, who died and left you in charge? And again, I'm not trying to be ugly, but the point of the matter is when someone makes that's like the employer saying that to the employee, unless you change it, you're all negative. We can't handle this in the workplace here. That's just not proper. That's just not the way it needs to be. Let's flip the page. 31 to 42. Give me a number.
33.
33. The reason I knew that is I read about that, but that actually happened because the lady had died. The family would not be going to the championship game. Hey, I know you got those tickets. Can I buy them from you?
oh, where did common courtesy ever come to mind in regard to the way we treat people? That should never have happened. Another number.
35.
35, yeah. Seriously. She's standing next to her husband's casket, and a lady comes up to her and says, "You don't need that ring on anymore." Now, a year later on, if the lady was floundering and dealing in a kind, loving, private situation, maybe they earned the right to say that. Maybe they didn't. But to say it then and there, at that point in time, how cruel, how calloused. Another number. What? 37. Yeah. When we're dealing with grief, we feel like that we have to, again, we've already said, we feel like I have to say something. And what people want to do is they want to say something that hopefully will make them feel better. But it's based on subjectivity. Well, and of course, the part of this that we don't know was what was said beforehand. Oh, I'm really sorry about your tragic child's loss, but you look like you're doing so well. Or to add to this, but your hair looks so good. Or that's a beautiful dress you have on today. I mean, it's just like, why did you even say anything? Again, Don will say tomorrow. Don't you hate setups? That's a setup, I guess. The simple words are the best words. Another number or two. 39. Why would someone want to say, God put it in my heart to tell you the Lord took your child down in his youth so that he would not suffer some great pain later on? Somewhere in either here or maybe that was the one, but they actually went in and said, well, your child probably growing up would have become a juvenile delinquent, so that's why God took them now so that they'd be with him forever. Are you joking? How terrible you could be. The point of the matter is, we have to think here in our head, but we've got to take it and move it through the heart before we say anything. And I promise you, if you will do that, what you say, as Paul said in, I think it's Colossians chapter 3, it will be seasoned with salt and it will provide grace to the hearers. That's what we want. We want what we say to be helpful. So let's turn. What can you say? Instead of you can't be angry with God. Just say the obvious. If you're mad at God, guess what? That's okay. Again, in situations when and see, there are some people, because of their attitudes, because of their disposition, they have to be mad at something. Terry probably can tell you that. I've had people mad at ministers, mad at me, because of what happened to their loss and their family situation. Mad at the doctors, mad at the funeral home directors, mad at family members. They're just looking for someone to blame. Well, God gets his due. He really does. And so when I just tell people, I've told people, it's okay for you to be mad at God. I can be mad at God. I said, yeah. You're not the first one's ever been mad at God. Then I always say, but just don't give up on him, because he's not giving up on you. And then I turn around and walk off. Put this behind you. You live.
Just feel what you feel. You see, validate their feelings. As long as their feelings are normal, or they're not hurting anyone, they're not any red flags from a counseling perspective in regard to self-harm or harming someone else, wherever the case may be, those feelings are going to change. So just let them know it's okay. I teach cancer support classes in Huntsville, and occasionally we will talk about it's okay to have your pity party. Just get off your pity pot after a period of time. It's okay. Well, the same is true in regard to grief. I know exactly how you feel. Notice, I can't even imagine what you're going through. Well, you can have other children. We've already talked about that. At least they didn't have to suffer much. You were good to them every need. You were always there for them. State the obvious. State something that will help them, not hurt them. That's the point. That's what we want to do here. Good will come out of this, I promise. Folks, they can't see any good coming out of anything at that point in time. They really, and that may not ever be true. So just don't say it. It's hard to understand why this happened. Period. I am so sorry. That's what people need to hear. We are at our worst when we're dealing with our grief in regard to our defense mechanisms. And we should not have to have an overload of emotions simply because of what someone has said that was not thought out. We've already talked about it's God's will. Like they say, time heals all wounds. Grief hurts. You be good to yourself now. See the point? See the difference? Take this Valium. Well, you feel like talking? Prescription medication has its place. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But the point of the matter is don't try to find a substitute just simply because of a substitute. And of course, unfortunately, someone said, hey, you just need to go get drunk. I mean, I've had people literally tell that, Christian people, you just need to get drunk and have a hangover for a while. No, that causes other issues. Let's just sit down with them and see if there's what we can do to help. You got to be strong for. We talked about that one. Call me if you need me. We talked about that as well. The important thing when it comes to the idea of dealing with our emotions, and Don's going to turn around and get into our. Don, are you ready to get into the next? We're just going to go straight into our segue into our next session. Think with your head, filter it through your heart. Don.
In no way are we suggesting the idea that in 6 hours' time, counting yesterday and today, that a person can make it through their grief journey. What we're trying to do is just perhaps provide information to open the door into your grief journey so that maybe you can have some information that will be helpful to that. And so please don't misunderstand that idea. But how does a person make it through their grief journey? How do people get through that? I started last night by mentioning you writing down 2 words, grief is. And I mentioned that a lot of times people in my classes would write their own thoughts. And I want you to listen to these 2 different statements and tell me what you hear from them. This one said, to me, grief is like falling into a bottomless pit, continuously hitting the sides and being cut by the sharp rocks. There's no end to the fall, and the pain never ends. There's no light at the end of the tunnel, no way out. It's probably like living for an eternity in hell would be like. Nothing will ever be the same, and so you wonder why go on. What did you hear in that statement? Despair? Hopelessness, sadness. This was a mother-in-law talking about the death of her son-in-law due to suicide. And those were the feelings that she felt. Now I want you to listen to this one. In the Webster's Dictionary, grief means a cause of such suffering, a mishap or disaster. To grieve means sorrow. Is that me or what? Okay. Anyway. Since May 22nd, 1999 at 7:55 p.m., not only has suffering been a part of my daily life, but that day was the worst mishap and the greatest disaster of my entire life. Sorrow is something that awakens me in the morning and it follows me everywhere all day and it goes to bed with me at night. People say, stay busy. How much busier can one be than to take a college computer class, go to a grief support class, stay active in church and help people less fortunate than I? I feel sad for what I have lost. I feel poor for the empty space. I cry for what I cannot have. I am restless, for my life is not whole. However, you cannot abandon the ship simply because you cannot control the winds. I am not going to give up on God. I am going to thank Him for what I have left. What did you hear her say?
She knows the source of help.
She knows the source of help. There is hope. There is an encouragement. This lady not only lost one husband, she lost two. And she knows the exact time when it became a part of her daily life. And interestingly enough, that date was the date of the death of her second husband, not her first. Her first husband died in a boating accident at age 25, drowning. The second husband died after about 9 or 10 years of cancer. That's the one that she said was the worst mishap. Interestingly enough, to her it was the anticipated long-term loss and not the other one. But as you said, she knew the source. And according to Psalm 107, verses 28 and 29, God's either going to still the storm or He's going to calm His child. Read that verses sometime. Psalm 107, verses 28 and 29, that He talks about that concerning His children. This lady that I just talked about that felt that way, she said that her husband had a hospital bed in a certain room of the house. And they're 9 years or so. And so when they came and took the hospital bed, it left the indentation marks in the carpet. That sometimes is the case. And she said that just spoke volumes to her. It was just too much. So she had to close the door to that room. And she said several months later, the 5-year-old grandson came in. And as he came into the house, he said, "Why is Poppy's room closed?" And before she could answer, he just opened the door and just started walking in and started talking about the times whenever he'd play games with Poppy and he'd get up in the bed and Poppy would tell him a story. And he said what she could not do as an adult for months had now been taken care of in like 2 minutes of time. And that door stayed open because it was not just how he died, but how he lived that made that significant. And there's something to be said for that. So, in common, and you've got a handout that talks about that, 600 bereaved families were asked, how do you make it? How do you persevere through the grief journey? Number one, they find someone to share their grief with. That may be old friends. It may mean their church. It may mean a new church. Has everybody found that one? In Common, I think it's called? Okay. They may, whatever that case may be. For some people, it may be that ultimately, if they lost a mate, they choose to remarry. Heard about this lady at a nursing home that was a resident there, and a new male resident moved in. On the first day that he was there, she walked up to him and said, "You look like my third husband." And he looked at her, he said, "Third husband, how many have you had?" She said, "2." If a person chooses to remarry, they're not replacing that person. They still, my father-in-law put it this way. His wife died after some 8 years of dementia, Alzheimer's. He was grieving before her death because of the declines and the losses all along. And within 6 months after her death, at age 79, he started dating someone. And about 6 months later, about a year, he married. And he said, "It's a compliment to my first wife that I choose to want to be married to someone else because she made it so good for me. I never thought of it that way." And so he was married to Barbara for 7.5 years, and it was a wonderful marriage before he ultimately passed away. But that was sort of the way he looked at it. Some people may choose not to do that, and that's certainly everybody's desire and intention. But they find someone to share their grief with, whether it's church, whether it's friends, whether it's new friends. I had a lady who had been married to 4 Christian husbands. 2 of them were brothers in the flesh as well as brothers in the Lord. All 4 of them were faithful Christians. And at age 86, when she was burying the 4th husband, her daughter was one of our church members. She said, "Brother Don, you think you can find me another husband?" And I thought, well... And then somebody heard said, "Well, who wants to be married to her? You're going to die." I thought that was sort of funny. But anyway, 2 years later, I did her funeral. And she was unmarried, but she was a good Christian lady. But I guess for her, there was always the desire to have a man in her life and in her home. Number 2, they make a decision to move on. Moving on does not mean forgetting. You will not forget. You will never forget. Grieving people are afraid that others are going to forget their loved ones, but they're not going to forget. But making a decision to move on, not forgetting. One person put it this way: "I've lost my wife, I'm looking, and half of me is gone, I'm looking for the other half." Someone said that the loss of a mate is like the loss of an extension, an arm, because it's so much a part of you. The loss of a child is like the loss of a lung. It's from within because it was conceived within. Those may be some accurate assessments of those losses. Number 3, they clean up relationships. After 9/11, a lot of people started having monthly reunions rather than every 2 or 3 years because they realized how important family was and the loss of family and how it could tragically happen in that manner. Number 4, they become forgivers. Forgivers. Ephesians 4 verse 32 talks about being kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. Why? Even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. There's a statement over in the Philippians 4 verse 5. It talks about the next point, becoming amends makers. Trying to make amends. And the statement there is, let your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is at hand. And that statement, gentleness, literally means be willing to meet people halfway. Sometimes we realize that there are people that we are at odds with, and sometimes if people are willing to get together and talk about it, that there's help in that. And yet people have to be willing to meet people and work with people. Number 6 is so very important in being able to make it through grief. They learn that in giving, they receive. You see, grief, first of all, has to be a mirror. And that grief needs to be a mirror as long as it needs to be a mirror. No one needs to take your grief away from you. No one needs to say, it's been X number of months, you should be over that by now. They haven't been there, else they wouldn't say that. So grief is a mirror. Nobody knows what my grief has done to me more than me. And so you want it to be a mirror as long as it needs to be a mirror. Feel it, deal with it, pray about it, do what you can to make it as you work through it. What you ultimately want it to do is to turn outward and become a window where you see the hurts of others and can help them even in the midst of your own grief. You see, there's some people in this audience today that can help people in their losses more than Ron and I ever can because we haven't experienced those losses. I can tell you about the loss of a mom, but I can't say anything about a dad or a child or a mate. Hope that never gets to that point. Loss of a grandchild, but some of you have had those, and so you can help people in ways that others cannot. But they learn that when that glass turns outward and becomes a window, and you begin to see the pains of others, and you begin to reach out to those people, you help yourself also. Bill McDonald is a funeral home director, an elder of the church in Centerville, Tennessee. He helped get us started in this work. I heard him speak in 1985 at International Bible College, which is now Heritage Christian University. And when I heard him speak, he made the statement that preachers were the second worst equipped group of people to deal with grief. So I go up to him afterwards and said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "Well, tell me what you do at your church when people who have died, people who have lost a loved one." I said, "Well, I call them up." "Great. What do you do after that?" I said, "Well, I go to the funeral visitation." "Great. What do you do after that?" "I go to the funeral." "Great. What do you do after that?" And I thought, he said, "That's what I mean. Too many people have to go through their journey alone because the church members aren't there to help them, or their preacher, or their elders." I had to admit sometimes I went back and didn't think about that journey that they were now on and how desolate and alone they might be because I had not been there to help them. So it was out of that Ron and I began to think about doing this that many years ago. But he tells a story about this lady that had her husband to die very suddenly. And they did the funeral. She began to come to him for counseling. And for some months, she wasn't able to move beyond the death to what now? What can I do with what is left? And after months of just staying in the same place, he said, "I don't want you to come back to me until you're ready to talk about not how he died, but how he lived and also how you're going to live," which is somewhat bold on the part of a counselor. One day he said he heard her before he saw her. She came into the funeral home. There was an outer office. She was laughing with the ladies out there. And then she came into his office. And unlike all the other times, she had a big smile on her face. "Hey, how you doing?" She said, he said, "Well, I'm doing pretty good." She said, "Well, you look so well." She said, "Have you done something to your hair?" No. She said, "Well, you got a new dress?" No. She said, "Let me tell you about it." So, "Well, sit down." So they sat down and said, "Bill, last night I made 12 dozen chocolate chip cookies." "Oh, you're on a sugar high." He said, No. She said, "I made 12 dozen cookies, took out those silver pans, put a dozen here, dozen here, wrapped them up, and took them to 12 families in this town that needed some help." And what was she saying? The loss was still there. The pain still there. But the glass had turned outward, and she was seeing the hurts of others, and she was helping herself while she was helping them. I know a family that back home made Christmas ornaments. They'd make them out of little different things, and they would give them to the church kids. And the mother did this, and she eventually died, and so her two daughters did it for years. And about a month ago, one of them died, the second one, and now the grandchildren and the nieces are doing that in memory of that matriarch so many, many years ago. The first year they said they couldn't do it. It was just too painful, which was fine. But the idea was we're doing something in their memory, carrying on the tradition, helping others to have a good time, while at the same time honoring them. People who make it through grief are able to not only see their own situation, but see the situations of others, and to be able to help them. And that means a great, great deal. This little boy was walking down a country road and he saw a big sign, "Puppies for sale." And so he walked up to where that man's house was, and he said, "Sir, you got some puppies?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I've got some registered puppies." He said, "Well, I got 39 cents. Can I see them?" He said, "Oh, yeah, you can see them. Come on, Dolly." Here came the mother dog, and behind it all these big, fat, furry puppies. Just running behind the mother dog, running toward the man, the little boy. And one of the dogs at the end was just really slowly coming out of the doghouse. Slowly running. It wasn't running nearly as fast as the others. "How much are your dogs?" And he named the price, and he said, "That one there." He said, "How much is that one?" He said, "Son, you don't want that dog. That's the one that has the bad leg. He was born with a bad leg. He's not going to be able to run and play like all the other dogs." Little boy pulled up his pants leg, and you could see a steel rod that ran from the bottom of his foot all the way up his leg. He said, "Well, I understand what it means not to be able to run and play like others." He said, "That dog's going to need somebody like me to understand him. How much is that dog?" And the man said, "There's no price for love. You can have it." Sometimes, in the midst of our own sorrows, in the midst of our own pains, we're able to see people and help in ways that no one else ever can. And folks who make it in the grief journey learn that in giving, they receive. Back in Tuscumbia, Alabama, there lived a lady by the name of Helen Keller. Any of you ever been to the outdoor play?
No.
Thank you. It's well worth going. You need to do that. Wonderful, wonderful story. She made this statement once: as long as you sweeten someone else's pain, life is not in vain. That's biblical, isn't it? Do unto others as you desire for them to do unto you. Philippians 2, look not on your own things, but every man also on the things of others. As Ron said, don't say, "Well, I'm just having to take care of myself. I'm just barely making it every day." That's fine. Grief, again, nobody can take care of yourself better than you. It's sort of the analogy, if one of you was on crutches and all of a sudden Terry back there says, "Hey, this place is on fire. Everybody get out." Wouldn't it be sad if we all took off and we didn't think about the person on crutches? Or we say, "Well, you don't need those crutches," and throw them away? Of course not. Everybody needs their crutches as long as they need their crutches. The same is true in grief. You be good to yourself. Hopefully there are others who are allowing you to, but you be good to yourself so that in time you can be able to help others. Number 7, folks who make it through the grief journey learn to live in the present moment. The Apostle Paul made that statement in Philippians 3, verses 13 and 14, forgetting those things which are behind, reaching forth from those things which are before. I press on toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. You think about what he had to forget. You think about how that he, as Saul of Tarsus, held the clothes of men who stoned Stephen to death. You think about how that he, as Saul of Tarsus, thought he was doing a good thing by going into Christian homes and hauling out fathers and mothers and taking them to prison. And he said, forgetting those things which are behind. They learn to live in the present moment. Finally, folks who make it through the grief journey share their new feeling of life. A good term for grieving people are wounded healers. The loss and losses that you deal with have caused wounds. The scars will always be there, whether they be physical or visible or invisible. Healers in the process of healing. It may take a long, long time. It may take a lot of work and a lot of effort. But they share their feeling of life. There is light at the end of the tunnel. William Faulkner, in his book Wild Palms, put it this way: between grief and nothing, I will take grief. Something for us to think about. Alfred Lord Tennyson put it this way: is it better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all? That's a question I often ask my class. Thinking about the loss and the grief that you're feeling now, is it better to have loved and lost that person than never to have loved at all? Only you can answer that. Only you can answer that. Had a lady who had lost a son in a car accident very suddenly. And she said, right now, no. Right now, she had 3 sons. He was one of them. He was 21. Right now, I just don't know if the pain is so great, if it was worth the pain for him to have been here because of how... That was her answer. Don't know if she still feels that way or not. Haven't seen her in a while. But everyone needs to be able to answer that question. We go to a cemetery and you'll see a tombstone. You'll often see 2 dates on that tombstone: the date of one's birth and the date of one's death. A person is on there, let's say that it's a tombstone where one mate has already died and the other mate's name is over here. You've got the date of birth, but what is there to designate that they're still living? What do we call that? The little dash, right? Right now, every one of us is living their dash, aren't we? God knows when that time's going to be, but we don't. So it's up to us to live that dash as best we know how to honor God, to honor our family, and to honor the memory of our loved ones. Earl Groman, a Jewish rabbi, said the greatest monument you will ever erect is to live a life of meaning and purpose to those who have died before you. There's something to be said for that. So my hope is that you will be able to honor those that you are grieving about by honoring God, by honoring His church, by honoring the God that they loved and the church that they loved, and that you can be a blessing to others even in the throes of your own grief. Are there any questions or any comments at the end here that you would like to bring up? Ron and I will stay around as long as you're interested in doing so. But I want to do that. But let me first, before I ask for that, mention to you about tomorrow. Sunday school will be how to minister to hurting. We'll be using a PowerPoint, talking about ways that we can help people, not just because of death, but folks who are dealing with cancer, folks who are dealing with dementia, folks who are dealing with other chronic illnesses. How can we help people who are living now and minister to them as well as their families? That's what that class is about. Then at the worship hour, we'll be looking at a panoramic view of the Bible and what it has to say about grief. Stories about grief in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, especially John chapter 11, if you want to read that ahead of time. Jesus and Lazarus and his sisters. And then after lunch, we'll be talking about 10 things that we can do to help this congregation as well as others in times of grief. And I'll give you a long list of things that people said in the first few hours and days. Here were the things that really, really helped me that we can do. Very practical things that we can do to help others. But having said that, any questions or any comments anyone would like to make? Yes, sir.
I think we've all done the wrong thing.
How's that?
I just mean, generally speaking,
Okay.
Different time.
we don't need to let that stop us from trying to learn to do the right thing.
Yeah.
We don't need to carry a load of guilt.
Very true. Very true.
That would be a wrong kind of grief, bad grief.
People want to know, grieving people want to know two things from other folks. One, you truly don't know how I feel, but two, you still care.
Yeah. Okay.
They are more than willing to even forgive you for maybe statements or something you made if they know that you care.
Yeah.
Because they just say, well, you just don't know, but you will learn along the way. But those are the two things. Truly don't know how one feels, but I still care. And if we show ways that we can care, then that covers a multitude of sins, if you know what I mean,
Yes.
in that manner. And we continue to learn. We thank you for we thank you for stories that you've told today that will help us in later years as we minister to other people. We've got, I think, about 3 or 4 more workshops in the next couple of months that we'll be doing. But anyway, feel free to stay around. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Just talk about who has helped you the most. You know, my family has been a big help to me.
Yes, sir.
But Mary, the mother of Jesus, has been my main help.
Okay.
She watched her son die and could do nothing about it.
That's a good point.
She has been a very big help to me.
That's a good point. And her son Jesus on the cross said, "Woman,
Yeah.
behold your son."
Yeah.
And I think that preaches a large responsibility that we have to take care of the other. I mean, Joseph, we probably think, was dead by then because he had not been mentioned in a long time. But it's interesting that he saw the need for John to see him when he had brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Maybe the idea was they're not going to be able to help. But there was a responsibility that he had that we now have. You know, when that first parent dies, that second one becomes even more important. I can see that with my dad. I started calling him every night at 8 o'clock. I didn't, normally when I called home, it was Mom would answer it, and he'd get on the phone, but not nearly as much. But I've spent a whole lot more time the last 2.5 years invested in his life because, one, I want to, and secondly, there's an obligation. And we're not going to feel any guilt when that time comes because all three of us have spent a great deal of investment in receiving far more than we've given and seeing after him, and rightly so. But thank you for sharing that. That's a great insight. It really is. And God bless your family. Why don't we end with a word of prayer? And then again, feel free to stay around as much as you'd like to, but why don't we just do that? Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Even though it's cold outside, we are reminded of the warmth of your love for us, even in the midst of tragedy and sadness. We ask that you'll be with all of these who have lost loved ones or who are trying to help in the midst of loss that they have had and other losses. We thank you for this church. We thank you for their willingness to have this workshop, and ask that you'll continue to bless this good church, and ask that you'll bless the elders and Terry and JJ and everyone else as they try to minister to the lives of others. We ask, Father, that you'll bless us with good health and the ability to be able to come back tomorrow and to worship you. And we thank you for the hope that you give us and for the blessings that heaven will be. In Christ's name, amen. Thank y'all so much for coming.